In a few minutes, every single white pawn you see on this chessboard will be sacrificed in one of the wildest chess games ever played. That sounds ridiculous, but that's exactly what happened in this extraordinary 19th century game between Dr. William Ballard and the seasoned London player Joseph Fagan. Ballard played white and began the game with a handicap. He actually started without one of his knights, which wasn't uncommon in his day, as it meant to even out skill advantages. White opens with pawn to e4, and when black mirrors with pawn to e5, immediately, Ballard goes for the king's gambit with f4, sacrificing the first pawn. Of course, black accepts it. Who wouldn't? Pawn takes pawn on f4, but that's the nature of this gambit. White wants black to get greedy, because while black is busy collecting material, white will be busy developing pieces and opening lines. Knight to f3 follows, while black plays bishop to e7. A quieter move than the common knight to f6, but one that supports early castling. Ballard, true to style, develops another piece with bishop to c4 already pointing at the sensitive f7 square. And in this position, black tries something cheeky. Bishop to h4 check. It looks dangerous because it forces white's king to move and lose castling rights, but Ballard simply throws another pawn forward with g3. This does two things at once. It blocks the check and tempts black to take yet another pawn. And sure enough, black can't resist. Pawn captures on g3. That's 2 pawns down already. But notice what happens next. White castles kingside, a very important move. The rook is activated instantly, the king is safer, and that sacrificed pawn becomes an open file aimed right at black's position. But in doing this, he leaves yet another pawn to be captured. Now black sees the lurking of some threat here and brings out the knight to h6, an awkward but defensive placement. Why not gobble more material with h2, you ask? Because it's not so simple. If black had taken that pawn, white's rook slides across to f1, the queen can come into the attack, and suddenly black's king is in real danger of being caught in the center. So instead, black avoids the trap and plays it safe with the knight. White continues sensibly with pawn to d4 controlling the center while black castles. Now Ballard decides to grab one of his pawns back with pawn to g3, but this just invites black's bishop into the attack, with bishop takes on g3. At first glance, this looks fine for black. The bishop is active, and another pawn disappears from white's side. But look closer. The bishop is now hanging out in enemy territory without many escape squares. And to exploit that, the white king steps up to g2, calmly attacking the bishop, and black has to retreat it back to d6. Already 3 pawns are gone from white's army, but he has gained time and activity. Rook to h1 now adds more pressure, eyeing that knight on h6. Black defends it with queen to f6. And here comes a sharp pawn thrust, e5, hitting both the bishop and the queen at once. But Ballard isn't worried about material, he's chasing momentum. But now, black has got a problem. His bishop and queen are under threat, and he has to figure out a way to get out of the mess. But here black finds something special. Queen to g6, check forcing the king to shuffle to f1 and then jumps a knight into f5, sacrificing the bishop. Suddenly the board is buzzing with tension. If white carelessly takes the bishop on d6, black's knight hops to g3 with check, forking king and rook. So Ballard doesn't bite. Instead, he places the rook on g1, pointing straight at black's queen. Black responds with knight to g3 check anyway. At this point, it feels like white is walking a tightrope. If he takes the knight, then after queen recaptures and he takes bishop, his rook on h1 is gone for a minor piece and his king is still in danger. So instead, white calmly steps to f2. Black keeps pushing the initiative with knight to e4 check, but Ballard continues to dance out of danger, moving his king to e1. Now, it may appear as if black could take the rook, but it is well defended. And even more pressing is the fact that black's queen and bishop are now hanging. Well, we saw black get out of it the first time. Can he do it again? Well, actually, yes. Black's next move reveals the fact he is no ordinary chess player. Bishop to b4, not only saving the bishop from danger, but also checking the king at the same time. White doesn't have the luxury to capture the queen sitting on g6, and moving the king carelessly would be too risky. So instead, white pushes the pawn to c3, throwing another pawn forward just to slow black down. 2 more pawns are now being offered. Black doesn't hesitate. Knight captures on c3, immediately threatening the queen on d1 and setting up dangerous discovered checks with the bishop. White has no choice but to capture the knight, and then comes bishop takes c3 with check. Now the rook on a1 is hanging too. In this short sequence, white has ended up giving away 2 more pawns, but survival is the only option. The king steps to f2, still under fire, while the queen on g6 remains under threat. Black sees he doesn't have the time to snatch the rook just yet and instead goes queen to c6, counterattacking. Now the rook on a1 and the bishop on c4 are both in danger, and white has to choose. With limited resources left, white decides to save the bishop, sliding it back to d3. This is the more valuable piece. Both bishops are now lined up and staring directly at the king's side. The knight will soon leap into the attack, and the queen is lurking close by. The rook, on the other hand, is doomed, but it's a price white is willing to pay. Black takes it. On paper, black looks dominant here. They're up a full rook and 4 pawns. It should be winning. But most of black's pieces are still undeveloped, and their king is anything but safe. White seizes the moment with another sacrifice, pushing the pawn to d5. This pawn is completely undefended, practically begging to be taken. But it's bait. If black's queen captures, white has bishop takes on h7 with check, and suddenly the queen on d5 would fall. Black senses the danger and instead throws in queen to b6 with check. White calmly blocks with bishop to e3, hitting both the queen and the bishop stranded on a1. Black replies with queen to b2 check, also covering the bishop. White's king steps to f1 and suddenly black has a problem. The bishop on a1 is trapped. It can't move, and the queen can't leave without abandoning it. So black tries to blunt the diagonal pressure with pawn to f5, stopping that looming bishop sacrifice on h7. But here, black starts to drift. The best continuation wasn't found, and when white plays bishop to d4 attacking both the queen on b2 and the bishop on a1, black misses the stronger defensive idea and instead grabs the pawn on a2. Not terrible, but not sharp enough. White strikes immediately. Bishop captures on a1, and when black recaptures queen takes d5, the balance shifts. White has given up the pawns on a2 and d5 in the process indeed, but the stage is only just being set for the final act. The last pawn sacrifice comes now with pawn to e6. It looks reckless, the very last pawn being thrown away, but there's poison in the move. If black captures, the dark-squared bishop wakes up and the pawn on g7 is gone. Black is forced to block with g6, but the pawn keeps rolling, e7, hitting the rook and threatening to promote. Black stops it with rook to e8, but white calmly slides the queen to e2. Now the pawn is untouchable and the queen has invaded the second rank. Black responds with queen to c5. But this move fatally misses white's real idea. The pawn on e7 isn't the focus anymore. White's queen shifts over to b2, pointing straight at the weak dark squares around the king. There is no defense. Black has to capture the e7 pawn, or queen to g7 is mate. So black tries the only move left, capturing the e7 pawn. And now all 8 pawns have been captured. Not a single one remains on the board. But then white strikes. Queen to h8 check. The king has only one square, f7. And the final blow, knight to g5 checkmate. The bishop and queen lock down all the dark squares. The queen also controls the entire 8th rank. And it's the knight that delivers the killing blow. After sacrificing every single pawn, the final word belongs to that lone knight who lost a brother even before the game began. If you enjoyed this beautiful piece of chess history, please leave a like and don't forget to subscribe for more chess content like this one. Thank you for doing that, and see you in the next one.